To say the first Watch Dogs game was received poorly would be an understatement. Its finished product was nothing like what was shown in previews, and the game, to many, was disappointing. Aidan Pearce was a well-written character, but Ubisoft were too afraid to put the spotlight on him, instead only allowing his most unlikable qualities to shine through. One such quality was his hacking ability, which for a game all about hacking was bare bones, leaving Watch Dogs to function better as a John Wick simulator rather than a hacking game. Despite this, the general public came back around to Aidan, with even myself making a video talking about how great the game is in spite of its release. What further aided Watch Dogs was that it released in 2014, just months before Assassin's Creed Unity, causing many to look back at Watch Dogs and consider that it may have been treated too harshly, but it was too little too late. No amount of retrospective praise could save Ubisoft from looking at the state of their heavy hitters in 2014 and deciding to make a drastic change. One such change was in Watch Dogs 2. When we first got a look at this game, you'd be right to think it was a reboot of the series. The tone had changed entirely, its world much brighter, its characters had character, and its hacking took center stage. But this shift and the success that came from it caused irreparable damage to the franchise. We now had two entries in a series that were worlds apart, and two fan bases sitting on either extreme. We can talk theoretically about how this would affect the series moving forward, but there's no need. Look at Watch Dogs Legion, a game that feels like the worst of both the first and second game. Now, there's plenty to enjoy about Legion still, and eventually I will dive into that, but for now I want to look at Watch Dogs 2 and see how it is in many ways the antithesis of the first game, and how it, to the series' own detriment, redefined what a Watch Dogs game is and could be. This is Watch Dogs 2, and the irreparable damage it did to the series. Something you may have noted is that while I think Watch Dogs 2 split the fan base in two, I didn't call it a bad game, and that's part of the issue. Watch Dogs 2 is, in my opinion, one of the best Ubisoft games released. Without flaws? No. But I hope throughout this video I can show you how many great qualities it has. To address the elephant in the room, I already have a video on Watch Dogs 2, but I wanted to revisit the game simply because the video I made 4 years ago now was terrible. Audio was bad, the script was poor, and while I don't intend to redo every video I've made, when I feel I severely didn't do a game justice or that my opinion has changed significantly since the video came out, I'll likely take another stab at it. With that out of the way, I want to begin by looking at the tone of Watch Dogs 2, specifically San Francisco, to see, in its purest form, just how much of a change it was from Chicago. San Francisco is a joy to explore, much more so than Chicago, and much like Chicago, it is a perfect canvas to build its story upon. Chicago made sense for Aidan's story. The constant downpour was reflective of the game's bleak outlook on Aidan's life. San Francisco presents a brighter approach that parallels the story's tone, one of lackadaisical freedom and lively fun. It's a backdrop that elevates the campiness of Watch Dogs 2 in a way that no other city could. This doesn't excuse the issues with this game's tone, or the dissonance within it, but this strength can't be overlooked. If a brighter, happier story is going to be told, this is a great place to do so. Ubisoft has always excelled in creating detailed worlds, and San Francisco follows suit, but it's different. It feels more alive, and it contains the most showboating from Ubisoft. Plenty of side activities here of which you are never forced to complete see you simply exploring the city and learning of its people. There are quests that see you taking pictures of landmarks and graffiti, and another questline will see you in the position of an Uber driver, basking in the slice of life that San Francisco provides. It creates a sense that Ubisoft knew that they had achieved something great, and intended on showing it off, and they earned that right. It's gorgeous, especially now that we're a few years out. Looking at this slice of the world during a period now historicized feels like time traveling, with the added novelty of traveling back to a time I once existed in. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. You thought you were gonna enjoy your stay here? Yeah, strap in buddy, the fog's coming. When the fog rolls in, your vision is screened to the point where traversing the ocean is like surfing in an endless void. The only structures visible are the monolithic bridges like a colossus in the distance. I never thought the rain of Chicago could be topped, and truthfully it isn't, but the fog comes respectfully close, and when it comes to the sun beaming down on the city, it's no competition. Watch Dogs 2 is downright gorgeous. NPCs in the first Watch Dogs were good, but not necessarily for anything they did, and rather for who they were. The Profiler was an ingenious way of making these people feel like people. A person on the side of the street isn't more than a collage of polygons, but when they have income, a name, a secret, they become characters, and that's just as important as the city itself being a character. Something I noticed in other reviews, my own included, is that in certain games like Spider-Man, New York is seen as this individual, almost separate from the civilians. Sure, the civilians are mentioned in that, but they are described in the same way one describes the buildings, set dressing. A game like Watch Dogs that aims to bring those individuals to life allows us to view the city through a more humanist lens. Not a collage of concrete constructions or a map to be explored, but a place, defined by its collective of individuals. This is difficult to achieve in a game though, because we will always be inhibited by our level of interactivity with the world. There are still remedies, the most notable being world building. Audio logs, environmental storytelling, and history help bring a world to life. Even games like Horizon Zero Dawn, where the amount of humans are significantly lower, is able to have an engrossing world through world building, even if this still presents a world that is composed of stories, past events, not the here and now. San Francisco is a living city because it has a past, it has a future, and it has a present that we can see and interact with. Here's a fun game. Load up Watch Dogs 2 and follow an NPC around. They don't disappear, they don't simply walk the same route. In my case, I came across a woman named Isabel Wang, who had a sizable yearly income and some interesting internet search history. I also came across my recording software that completely shit the bed, so now my footage looks like this. In a split second, I can learn a ton about this person and infer even more. I know that despite her income, she dresses casually, and her vehicle, while nice, isn't anything outside of her income bracket, so she's not frivolous. Perhaps this can be used to infer the economic state of San Francisco, as it is a tech hub and thus an expensive place to live, but it could also mean that Isabel is smart with her money. How I learned of her vehicle is that I followed her, for scientific purposes, and I saw her get into her vehicle and drive away. As I explored, I saw even more NPCs just going about their day, and this was something the first Watch Dogs excelled at too. Sometimes people would just be dancing around and we can join in. Sometimes they're on the phone talking with people, but the point is that the people are always doing something, and that helps make the city feel alive. NPCs walk along the street, have generic dialogue in reaction to your actions, and are as deep as their model, but people have conversations unrelated to you. They have things to do, they fight, they make mistakes. And the citizens of San Francisco fooled me well. The humanity of characters is something this game achieves well across its story too. Your friend's dialogue is always staggeringly human, and though the writing has received criticism, and that's something we will address later, the delivery is top-notch, as are the cutscenes. The cutscenes in Watch Dogs 2 are unlike any other game I've played. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say it's like a cheesy sitcom. There's plenty of points where a laugh track wouldn't be out of place.
You've got a weird relationship with technology, you know that, right?
Take any cutscene and look at the non-speaking characters and you'll see what I mean. Characters fiddle with things in the background, they have subtle reactions to what's being said. They sometimes look directly at the camera as if to say, "Are you hearing what I'm hearing?" This of course reflects the lighter tone of the game, and many have taken issue with this direction, but I'm part of the people who love it, even if I understand the hate it gets. Many of the issues with Watch Dogs 2 can be traced back to the drastic shift in tone from the first game, and the cutscenes do the same. Based on the cutscenes alone, ignoring the story, it would be difficult to tell that these two games are from the same series. In fairness, the UI feels consistent with the series, and I appreciated the overhauls to the profiler, and I like that you use your phone to navigate menus. Also, there are actual dogs in this game, so on top of being a watchdog, I can watch dogs too in Watch Dogs 2. Just one of the many citizens of San Francisco is Marcus. Marcus has a personality that is the antithesis to Aidan. They may believe in the same morals, but Marcus's personality continually shines through, at times to his own detriment. He has fun with his pseudo-vigilantism and doesn't hide his personality behind trauma, but I need to admit something. I cannot stand Marcus's outfit in this game. In the beginning mission, it's fine, but afterwards he plasters his clothes with DedSec logos and artwork, and I just couldn't stand it. I normally try to use the canon clothing, but I'm sorry, I couldn't do it here. In fact, this is an issue I take with most of the clothing options here. There are plenty of clothes that are all slightly different shades of the same color, which means finding synergy with your outfits is difficult, and I couldn't find anything I liked, so I just went with a boring all-black outfit so I could at least justify in my own headcanon that it was for a tactical advantage. Games always do this, where they have the same base model for a piece of clothing, but only a few color options for it. Why not have more? It must be a design issue that I'm not privy to, but at least these shoes were cool. Every other character has style and personality that shines through in just about every interaction with them, and it makes this DedSec crew one of the most memorable, except for Horatio, and we'll get to him later. Even if fundamentally this DedSec is nothing like what we've been told, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy this portrayal of the group. Everything from their laid-back approach to hacktivism to their headquarters, which is called, and I shit you not, the hackerspace, shows us a theme in Watch Dogs, which is the power that technology provides you. Marcus and friends are just as efficient, capable, and smart as Aidan, but their personalities say otherwise. Aidan is brooding, works on the ground, ran with criminals. He doesn't have a base, he has a bunker, a hideout. Marcus is smart and has a fierce, rebellious heart, but physically neither him nor the rest of the crew can match Aidan, and yet through their hacking know-how, they're able to become something bigger than themselves. Yes, it's ridiculous that people with memes like this on the wall, or people as socially awkward as Wrench, are technically the same people capable of taking down corporations, but I believe that one of Watch Dogs' themes, specifically once we get into Legion, is that the individual, no matter who, is capable of bringing about change, and this cast supports this statement. The people of San Francisco are not the only ones to see this depth, as the gangs around town feel alive too. It's not uncommon to see gangs in the police who in some exceptional irony operate just like a gang, getting into altercations, causing shootouts, arrests, and for the smart player, distractions. When I attempted to take down some gang members, the police showed up, and this complicated things for both sides. Now the police were onto me, but they were also onto the Tescas, meaning all hell broke loose, and it's one of the most memorable moments in the game. And this isn't even a rare scenario. This can even be engineered by you, as an upgrade will allow you to call either the police or a gang member to take down an enemy, and if you call them both, then congratulations, you've just started a war. This is one of many ways that Watch Dogs 2 allows you to utilize hacking as a means of impacting the world and its people, and not simply the technology surrounding them. A final note about the world and presentation of Watch Dogs 2, it's that Marcus's weapon is just mesmerizing to watch. It's such a simple yet creative design, and despite the fact that he's definitely splitting some fucking melons with this thing, it is also so damn satisfying to see the way this thing just whips from hand to face. The same is also true for Marcus's movement. His walk is just full of the exaggerated swagger of a hacking teen, and little details like him unplugging and replugging his earbuds in before and after conversations, or the way he reaches for the button on the side of the string when answering or ending a call, makes Marcus feel again like a real human. What doesn't is his exceptional parkour abilities, which sees flips and dives within his movement, and yeah, when running from enemies with guns, there should be no reason that you do a front flip, but hey, if I've illustrated anything here, it's that fun was a top priority, and this extends to the gameplay. Gameplay in Watch Dogs 2 is nothing like the first game. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but at its core, these two games play completely differently, because Watch Dogs 2 discourages any approach that doesn't involve hacking, and that's great. While Watch Dogs 1 was a great game because it provided a John Wick simulator, that was the problem too. The hacking didn't take enough of the spotlight. Here, Marcus has many factors to encourage hacking, such as a widened moveset, harder stealth, and less forgiving combat. Marcus is skilled enough to get by, but he isn't stronger or faster than the enemies in front of him, and rightfully so. If you want to take down the average thug, you'll need to rely on your hacking and outsmart your opponents. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's first look at Marcus and see what tools he has. When I said stealth was encouraged, it's because there aren't advantages to open combat. Using hacks in mid-combat can turn the tides, but most of the enemies don't miss, and they won't passively wait for you to move. Further, you don't have focus. This was the ultimate tool for Aidan, and it allowed him to reliably ignore stealth or hacking. Here, you'll find that a guns blazing approach, while still possible, isn't as fulfilling because the cool factor is gone. Hacking can still offer the advantage you're looking for, like blackouts, jamming earpieces, and using explosives, but when the stealth approach is this fun, I can't see how anyone would choose the loud approach. But hey, that's just me and my preferences. Marcus excels at stealth because he has more to help him, not just in the planning phase, but also in the execution phase, sort of. Instead of limiting the tools available to you, Watch Dogs 2 limits your ability to utilize them with botnets. Now, most useful hacks outside of opening doors and hijacking cameras cost a finite resource. This allows the planning phase to not be an analysis of the environment looking at what can I use, but what should I use. Botnet does refill over time, and certain people will carry some botnet that can be hacked from them, but this still means that there are only so many actions you can do at once. Now I had to think of encounters differently. Who needs a distraction? Who needs to be taken out? But Watch Dogs 2 presents a new question. Do I need to be there? This is something the first game had teased, the idea that a job could be completed remotely. Watch Dogs 2 offers something close to this, depending on what your definition of remote is. Sure, you can complete a mission without Marcus himself physically entering the locations, but you have to do this by using the jumper, which while being smaller and opening the doors, or should I say vents, to new parts of a location, you are virtually doing the same thing, but trading any offensive capabilities for being harder to detect. It's a new way to traverse a stealth encounter, but it isn't quite as remote as I had hoped it would be, and I now realize that makes sense. If we were to genuinely allow for a remote approach, said approach would see you using camera angles and wise hacking to reach an objective, and you'd have to restrict what cameras are where, but this could interfere with those who want a hands-on approach, as the information gathering stage of stealth is unnecessarily prolonged. This balance is exactly why I can't criticize the current setup, because both using the jumper or doing the work yourself is viable, and neither option is marginally better than the other. You could argue that the jumper is better once you have more upgrades, but even then, the lack of defensive capabilities severely hinders it in many ways. I personally preferred physically entering locations because I got to feast my eyes on some of the animation work, and I enjoyed the extra challenge. If we added a truly remote means of completing objectives, we would have to either limit the level design or risk the player doing only that, as it would be the most effective method with the least risk. The reason we can't limit the level design is because it works perfectly as it is now from a hacking standpoint. Sure, there's plenty to say about mission structure, enemy layouts, or the stealth as a whole, which can be needlessly frustrating, but in terms of hacking, the level design allows for a smooth progression both for the experienced and inexperienced players. Something to know when creating a sequel is that you need to factor in the players who are already familiar with the game. In Watch Dogs 2, since I played the first extensively, the basics of hacking, utilizing cameras, and shooting are familiar and thus relatively boring compared to the new mechanics. This meant that, when playing for the first time, because I had the choice between being hands-on, something I was far too familiar with in Watch Dogs 1, or remote, I could choose to approach a mission through an unfamiliar means. But this approach too eventually reaches a point of trivialization. It's at this point that the game reaches a turning point in progression where you stop unlocking new abilities and can achieve greater freedom in how you approach a scenario. At the beginning, cameras will be your number one means of information gathering, but cameras always have blind spots, and that means that even when you've scouted everything you can, there will still be surprises and thus tension, which is great. But once the game ran out of new things, conveniently for me, it was around the time I purchased the quadcopter, and everything opened up. The quadcopter is a remote drone that can be used to survey areas, take down enemies in a very limited fashion, and allows for quality of life, especially when solving puzzles. The reason this opens up the game is because now there are no blind spots. You can see everything. This speeds up the information phase, something that by now begins reeking of tedium, and it allows you to begin conducting plans, orchestrating what devices explode explode and which enemies are distracted, creating a path for you to pass by or creating enough chaos for you to take everyone out. This combined with the botnet restrictions, and you can look at all the different ways you can approach something and execute. In some instances, I took the old-fashioned approach, Aidan style, and in others I tried to take a passive approach, aiming to merely slip by in the middle of a blackout. Said blackouts along with other mass hacks are now on a cooldown, which is another solid balance change. In the first game, though it took some prep time, blackouts could be used again and again through crafting. Now the tedium of crafting is reduced, and instead of using it over and over again, you can instead mix them with the other abilities on cooldown. Maybe you want to do a blackout to blind the enemies, and once the systems are back online, jam their comms to deafen them. While we're on the subject of a blackout, I appreciated that detection was lower during them. This was supposedly the case in the first game, as many pointed out, but I found it difficult to notice the difference. Here though, it's night and day, at times quite literally. Enemy detection is severely hindered in the dark, but this doesn't mean stealth is a cakewalk. In fact, despite having a wider selection of tools, the stealth in this game can be really difficult, and not always for the best reasons. Opponents patrol at a reasonable pace, investigate sounds, and generally act quite smart, but this game commits a cardinal sin in my eyes, and that is the moment you are detected, everyone surrounding your location will know where you are. At first, I assumed this was a clever way tech is being used against us. Maybe these guards are really quick to hit some kind of panic button on their radio, but this isn't the case because it applies to dogs too. This will occur the near instant you are spotted with a minimal amount of wiggle room, and it applies to when enemies make noise too. This makes stealth insanely unforgiving, and I assume this was an intentional choice because the other Ubisoft games like Assassin's Creed are far easier on you. This is another form of balance, where you're forced to choose your targets carefully, and the way you counteract how quickly they alert the base is by distracting them with a text, allowing you to either sneak up to them or pass by undetected. You can still take down a guard the old-fashioned way, but again, due to botnet, you have a limited number of fake texts to send, and thus a limited number of risk-free takedowns. But even this does not solve yet another issue with detection, and it's a result of the very takedowns you perform. Marcus has a slew of animations that look great as established, but these takedowns are inconsistent. Sometimes he'll bring his opponent to the ground, and in others he'll strangle. Hell, sometimes he just gives them a good slug in the back. The problem is, it's hard to keep track of all these animations, and at times, I'll be in a good spot to take someone down, but pull an unlucky animation, meaning I'm spotted simply because Marcus decided to style on someone. Said enemies have quite minimal variety, but that's okay, because taking them down was not often the goal, and thus getting through them with the available technology was where the challenge lied. Heavy enemies like their appearance in the first game require a melee takedown if it's to be done quietly, and this adds complexity especially if using the jumper, because a simple shock or a small explosion won't be enough to take these guys down. There are multiple factions of enemies, but they never separate themselves much mechanically. The real fun comes from their AI, which is complex enough to almost feel like you are manipulating actual people, which feels great and sounds terrible out of context. I'll never forget the amount of times I intentionally took down an enemy in an area where civilians could see, causing a ruckus but not alerting the rest of the guards to my location, and once a guard goes over to discover the body, most of the others will head over to investigate, and this is a prime opportunity to sneak by them. Or one time where I was deep in a Bloom server room, and as a small army was approaching, I took one out, caused a blackout, and then jammed their comms so I could get away without being seen at all. The stealth fundamentally has the systems in place for situations like this to feel authentic, and again, like you're slinking between people's sightlines, not manipulating AI. When traversing from point to point, you could fast travel, which is appreciated, but don't sleep on the driving, that is still pretty good here. It feels heavy and realistic, but I'd struggle to call it something I engaged with as much as the first game. Thankfully, there are some added features like the nitro that are fun, and the selection of vehicles is still varied. I appreciated that different areas like the first game offer different choices. It's more common to see a 4x4 in areas where the dirt paths are more common, and using the environment to reach locations has the potential to be interesting. In one instance, I had to use a crane to pick myself up, but in what felt like 90% of the other instances, I just looked around for a scissor lift nearby. Keeping with the first game, the puzzles return and in the same interesting ways, though they are far deeper here and thus more enjoyable. Hacking the grid line sees new complexity, and while again there are no head scratchers, and some of the larger hacks result in more redundancies to focus on size as a substitute for difficulty, they take a boring minigame and make it slightly less boring, so consider it improved. Furthermore, these hacks take place in the open world, and thus integrate peering at the puzzles through the camera for an added layer of challenge, further amplifying the puzzle's complexity and further amping the utility of the quadcopter. Marcus's toolkit and the options available to him are yet another way this game is the antithesis to Aidan's story. Marcus is built for his stealth approach and often does not function well in combat, or at least not as well as Aidan, who otherwise thrives in a bullet storm. This dynamic is ironic given how outspoken Marcus is, and how secretive and otherwise stealthy Aidan is when traversing the public. Are both of these toolkits good? Yeah, but it's a drastic shift, and one I'd argue is for the better. While I would commit unspeakable atrocities to get the focus ability back in Watch Dogs 2, the added depth, the stealth, the new hacks, the botnet system, the AI, and those buttery smooth takedowns are a reasonable trade-off. Level design this time around is better and far more memorable than the first game, and the biggest culprit of that is the spectacle. There is a consistent stream of interesting locations, objectives, and mechanics to supplement the poor story excuses for these set pieces. At times you'll be breaking into a penthouse, and at others you'll be remotely driving a car away from the police, or you'll be breaking into a rocket building facility to hack a satellite. Each one of these moments also felt balanced, so I never felt that any of the layouts were unfair or too easy. Granted, there were many restrictions I placed on myself. I didn't like using guns or stun guns that much, but the point remains that the things you do are engaging, whether that's classic stealth through melee or letting out a rabid dog and letting him do the work for you. Watch Dogs 2 finds interesting ways to continue upping the ante, and the late game encounters, and especially some of the online encounters, are a proper challenge, even with all the upgrades. Where level design differs the most is in how you can move the environment for an advantage, not just how you can explode a ridiculous number of junction boxes. One of the goofier strategies I had when I was forced to defend a room against incoming security was to repeatedly close and turn off the remote operated doors leading into the room. The result was slapstick, but when we're already in a game as laid back as Watch Dogs 2, this strategy fits perfectly. You might notice that the things taking place here are not entirely new. I mean, we've seen the stealth or combat approach to missions for years by this point, but it's the way the sandbox actually plays a role in the gameplay that other worlds don't capture quite the same, even to this day. The society that is San Francisco is your tool, and the product of its tech-centered philosophy allows for more freedom in what is virtually a box than any other game I've played. Of course, you might find more to do in an immersive sim, but Watch Dogs 2 doesn't shoot for the same goal. Watch Dogs doesn't want to give you the illusion of freedom, but instead a wide range of things to interact with, so vast that they ditch the theatrics of immersion, I assume as a means of showboating. While the main missions are a near constant stream of entertainment, I expected the side content to feel subpar, and in many ways that's not true. Sure, it never reaches the same scale as the later story operations, and they can be short, but I never found myself getting bored either. And some of the reveals here are insane, like when you run into Aidan Pearce again. Given the tone of this game, I half expected Aidan to crack one-liners and say poggers upon being rescued, but the game instead treated him with respect. And it showed to me that despite Ubisoft aiming to take the tone of this game in a separate direction, they weren't going to discount the previous game's world in the process. Where the side missions excel is in showcasing the smaller work the team does. Our main operations surround taking down Bloom, and while the crew all come from different backgrounds, their hacktivist goals remain the same. The fundamental cause DedSec fights for is bringing justice to the shitty people in the world, and that includes pharmacists, corrupt cops, and teaching lessons to young people unaware of the revolution in front of them. The justifications for some of these missions might not be the best. Someone just asked Marcus to drive a bunch of go-kart races, and he asked no questions about it. And one instance left me scratching my head when Satara, in an attempt to teach her cousin a lesson about online security, hacks her light switch's music and breaches her privacy. There are certainly better ways to go about teaching this lesson, but it doesn't satisfy the player's prying eyes. We like being in control, and we like messing with people, which is exactly why there are so many ATM hacks. There's no gameplay here. You just watch somebody react to either being given a ton of cash or losing it in an instant. You get to play God, and I enjoyed seeing how they would handle themselves and then acting accordingly based on whether or not I thought they were an asshole. It's a shallow moment, but if these NPCs weren't so human, I wouldn't have happily played God as much as I did. This mission does introduce a few moral questions, because you could hypothetically destroy people's lives, and Marcus just keeps expressing how fun it is, but that kind of internal contradiction is one we'll tackle when we cover the main story. Point is, outside of the massive attacks and plot lines, the small-time gigs land surprisingly well, and I think it's because of the superhero parallel that many have drawn from this series. Many have stated that Aidan uses his hacking like a superpower, and this applies to Marcus too. When we play as a character that wants to help people, it becomes so much more believable when they're not just stopping the big bad guys at the top, but taking down the small-time crooks too. It resonates in a similar way to Spider-Man games that have you helping someone find their cat, and I understand the stark differences in that comparison, but the sentiment remains. Unlike the first game, there is no reputation meter, and that could either be a result of it being underdeveloped or misinterpreted in the first game. I fell victim to this too, as I referred to it as a morality meter, which just isn't true, but nonetheless, morals are thrown out the window here. And this dissonance between Marcus's morals and the destruction he causes ends up being a major point of criticism, which I plan to tackle later. For now, I want to mention another aspect of the world, which is multiplayer. Few sacrifices have been made here. The invasions are still here, but they lose some focus in exchange for the co-op missions. These are designed to be completed with 2 or 3 friends, but they function as solo side missions exceptionally well. And while in terms of replayability they won't beat the option to replay the main story and those side missions, I always found myself coming back to them, and they were where I started when I came back to the game from a long hiatus. It's in these missions I realized how well most of the missions here are designed around the mechanics of the game. When I first came back to these this year, it was after not playing Watch Dogs 2 for years, and I found them really challenging, but once I replayed the campaign and knew what to analyze before heading into an objective, they became much more manageable. This is, in essence, what these achieve, a playground to flex your skills. It also highlights the strength of Watch Dogs 2's gameplay, because despite having no story, slim excuses, and with each mission being little more than an outpost or two, they remain engaging. Even if the side content on display here didn't hit the mark on all occasions, what is here is a solid mix of small-time shenanigans and large-scale operations. I certainly felt that the side quests did less to set up or even further the world that was presented in the first game, but I can imagine that's a tough act to follow, especially when we're swapping out grey hat hackers for red-nosed clowns. This extends to the story as well, where the most we hear of interesting topics like Bellwether, Aidan, Berlin, Chicago, or really anything else is a passing mention or a conversation that speaks about it in a manner that kills any intrigue. Something the side quests also illustrate, and the DLC proves this too, is that Watch Dogs 2 is at its best when it forgoes the grander narrative. Watch Dogs 2 presents a simple story. Marcus Holloway, an experienced hacker, wants to take his skills to the next level and sees that DedSec is the way to do that. The main cast is Wrench, the group's hardware expert, Satara, the branding and social media expert, Josh, the software expert, and Horatio. You may notice I didn't give Horatio an associated skill, and that's because he doesn't have one. The most development we get from Horatio in the first act of the game is that he was previously a DJ, and that he and Marcus initially hit it off well. If this was expanded upon in any way, we'd be in business, but instead, we learn nothing more until one mission before he dies. I promise, that wasn't a spoiler, because Horatio is never much help in the story. He's not in any of the side content, most of which is filled to the brim with dialogue, and even when he does get screen time, it's not enough to make us care about him. I'll admit, the mission within Noodle is fun, and the running gag of Horatio having to swap to corporate mode is relatable, but when he dies, I didn't care, and this is a shared sentiment among many who played the game. As Marcus gets close with the crew, he forges a plan to take down Bloom once and for all. Lofty ambitions for a crew of 5, but through smaller operations that aim to expose just how many cookie jars Bloom has her hands in, those goals become more and more achievable. You'll be quickly escalating from corrupt politicians to hacking entire satellite networks, all while tangled in a web of side plots. These B-plots don't necessarily take away from the main goal, but they certainly muddy the waters. Multiple missions are spent getting revenge for Horatio's death, multiple missions are spent in a hacker war, and while the cause of these events are linked to Bloom, I never felt as though I was progressing the fight in any meaningful way. Rather, I was clearing the roadblock, allowing myself to get back on track. The main antagonist is Bloom, but the figurehead is Dushan, who continues to taunt and fight back against DedSec, at one point stifling their ambition. I think Dushan, despite having little to no depth, works well as a trophy villain for us to hate. He's condescending, intelligent, and is even wise enough to try and nip DedSec in the bud, but he lacks presence outside of the few cutscenes we see of him, and even fewer are the interactions with the crew, making this a forgettable villain that reeks of untapped potential. He's a great foil to DedSec, the antithesis. DedSec is a bunch of punks, so having Dushan act as a man-bun wearing Starbucks drinking normie has room for comedy, but it's never seized. Instead, Dushan acts to put roadblocks in the crew's way, his biggest attempt arguably being at the beginning, where he seemingly causes the crew to stop their fight against Bloom for a time. Said ambition is quickly rejuvenated by the recruitment of Raymond Kenny, aka T-Bone, who helps him get back in the fight. I mentioned this when talking about the return of Aidan for a brief time, but I appreciate that T-Bone meshes well with this game's world, and while he may not mesh that well with the others in the group, he doesn't feel altered in any ways to better fit the narrative. This is aside from one moment where he, understandably, protests a plan to cause a mass blackout, but his resistance is dampered oddly fast for someone as stubborn as him. I also felt that his inclusion at the end was slightly out of place. The entire crew had a part in taking down Dushan, and while Ray contributed plenty, and maybe it's important to have him there for the sake of completing his redemption that was started in Bad Blood, it still felt odd for the final encounter to include only Marcus and T-Bone. I would have appreciated seeing his guilt from Bad Blood resurface more than in a few dialogue lines, but I can understand how that may be at odds with the overall tone. After recruiting Ray, the crew investigates Blue's involvement with gang operations, and Horatio is killed. Horatio's greatest tragedy is that he was born to die. His character served no other purpose, and that sucks, because it makes him utterly wasted, and even his death is wasted. Can you imagine how much more impactful Horatio's death would have been if it was someone like Satara or Wrench? I'm not saying we should kill these characters off, of course not, I like them, but it creates a divide between the player and the game when we forget Horatio's around for most of the game, and yet Marcus is as angry as if his own son was killed. What further doesn't help is Horatio's design. The guy just looks generic, and I wouldn't be surprised if he really was created for the sole purpose of being killed later. Like the writers initially planned for a different character to die, but realized they liked all the other characters too much, and decided to create a new one to take the bullet. It would also explain why he's barely in any promotional art, but to be fair, Josh isn't in a ton of them either. Anywho, eventually the gang makes a final push against Bloom, getting into their main servers and gathering enough evidence to put Dushan away for good. The third act of the game is exceptionally well done when it comes to progress. In the beginning hours, your operations feel disconnected from the main goal because they really are. You aren't taking down Bloom, you're building an army. So by the time the final act rolls around and we're completing operations with the explicit goal of getting dirt on Bloom, it allows each mission to feel impactful. Furthermore, the difficulty ramps up a considerable degree, which makes the missions feel all the more climactic. And the high-octane set pieces that accompany them, like breaking into and out of a penthouse suite and piloting a spider bot just like in Aidan's digital trips, was great. Unfortunately, when the game ends, not all is well. Like the first game, Watch Dogs 2 ends on a somber note, with the player knowing that despite the success of the protagonists, their efforts were in vain. Granted, this was an issue not with Watch Dogs 2, but with Legion, the mere existence of which confirms that Marcus and friends never could stop the inevitable. This is an unavoidable problem for the game. If they go the route of Watch Dogs 1, where the story is ironically human, hacking and technology can feel as though it's taking a back seat. But if they take the route of this game, then they have an ending that feels undermined by the existence of a sequel, which will naturally aim to raise the stakes. What puts salt on this game's wound wound is that there are many points where it feels as though our efforts are pointless. The entire first act sees us not making a dent into Bloom's operation, and while Marcus eventually takes a leadership role by the end, replacing Sitara as DedSec's figurehead, it doesn't feel like it's earned, because the characters are essentially doing the same thing they've been doing since the beginning, but now they've gone through trauma. I think a lot of this boils down to the characters, and I know I'm contradicting myself here because I do love these characters, but none of them have meaningful arcs. Outside of the team's morale, no individual changes in any way from the beginning of the game. Ubisoft struck gold with a cast that is effortlessly able to fill audio gaps with charismatic dialogue and cutscenes I never skip on repeat playthroughs because their interactions are so enjoyable, capable of creating something from nothing, and yet they are content with only providing excuses for us to see these characters do nothing. This is seen most notably through my favorite character, Wrench. Wrench is my favorite character because he's just a goofy little guy, and while he might be a little too over the top, I promise we'll talk about the cringy writing later, I love how unique the character is. During the later half of the game, Wrench is captured, and despite being released, his mask is seized. Marcus immediately knows that this mask is part of who Wrench is. Hell, the game does a great job of making Wrench look uncanny without the mask, and we also get to see that the mask is meant to hide something. Without it, he's scared, his voice quiet, his personality gone. The game has the choice to dive into this. What is Wrench hiding from us? If we unpack these things, we can sympathize more with the character, and if we understand why the man under the mask is so timid, we can better appreciate why the mask is so over the top. Unfortunately, we don't get that. It's touching to see Marcus be a good friend, but that's all we see, when we could have seen even more. Once the mask is back on, it's like it was never taken off. Sitara is shown to have a past in freerunning and a passion for tagging spots around town, but this never leads to any growth, no depth. We don't learn anything. I assume with every spot tagged, she would call us and tell a story about that location and her previous exploits, but instead we continue to impress her over and over, and that's about what Marcus does throughout the game. Marcus is simply perfect. He's caring, hard done by, skilled enough to keep up with Raymond fucking Kenny, and consistently impresses everyone around him. This makes him relatively boring. I can't project myself onto a character that's flawless because I'm not flawless, and if that is the goal, then why give the character personality within the dialogue? Why not allow us to create our own character and have Marcus replace Horatio? Sure, the crew's outsmarted every now and then, but they quickly bounce back, leaving us feeling as though they haven't learned from their mistakes, or made really any mistakes at all. This is my biggest gripe with the story. We have these characters that have interesting foundations, and yet nothing is built atop them. Now, that might be my biggest gripe, but if I were a betting man, I'd bet it's not yours. The story of Watch Dogs 2, specifically the writing, has been and will continue to be the biggest point of contention from its critics. Claims that the story is poorly written or that the dialogue is cringy will be at the front lines of any argument, but before we delve into that, I need to try and analyze what cringe is, because in the last decade it has been misused so much that it has taken on a new meaning that we have to consider. Cringe is officially defined as a type of secondhand embarrassment, and more semantically, it results in a strange gut or chest feeling. Cringe, on the internet, however, is a reductive means of describing anything you don't like. You don't have to explain what it is that bothers you about something anymore, now you can just call it cringe. Cringe is a substitute for nuanced critique, and proof of this is in any interrogation. Next time someone says something is cringe, ask them, why is it cringe? In my experience, many don't have an answer. Now, this is not to say that the people who don't like the writing in Watch Dogs 2 and those that call it cringe are wrong, but it's to say that we need to identify what about the writing rubbed people the wrong way, because what's cringe for me might not be cringe for you. And this also is not to say that the writing in the game is good. Instead, I want to take a deeper look at the strengths and weaknesses here. So with that said, let's look at the writing. Watch Dogs 2 does not necessarily attempt to be hip or cool, but to be natural and fun. And when you're having this much dialogue all the time, you're bound to fuck it up a bit. I believe that everyone who has played this game through likely has two lines that stuck with them after playing the game. One that was funny enough to stick with them, and another that made them say, Marcus, why the fuck would you say that? In my case, this was the bad one.
Got the game on lock like we changed the key. What? Danny Brown. Man, fuck all y'all.
You know, I'm a nerd, and I like Danny Brown, but you will never catch me saying that shit. Ever. While on the flip side, this was the line I enjoyed a lot.
Stingrays would be cool.
Oh, no, fuck that, dude. Those fuckers killed the crocodile hunter. You can't trust them. Veto.
How's it coming along, guys?
So far, we vetoed stingrays and orcas, but dolphins are still on the table.
Oh, no, they're not. Ugh.
Good call on the stingrays. Those killed the crocodile hunter.
Yo, I'm so confused right now. What are we talking about?
I've had conversations like this before, and they weren't cringy. This is the peak of casual conversations, and there's a lot of dialogue like this. Granted, the issue there is that a lot of it is pointless. We're just talking for the sake of talking, but that is realistic. I've had countless pointless conversations just like that with my friends, and while stingrays have never specifically come up in conversation, any comparable pointless topic certainly has. I too, just like the characters here, say cringy things. And the argument isn't that the use of hacker lingo and cheap jokes aren't cringy, they are, but it's that it's accurate. accurate. I'll expose myself a bit here. I commonly use internet lingo in my day-to-day speech with friends. I will casually say poggers, or W, or L, and I will frequently quote whatever meme is circulating for that month, and I'm not gonna name any names, but I know for a fact that your favorite YouTubers do it too. Is it cringe? Maybe. But what matters is, it happens. Now, just because it happens doesn't make it not cringe, I get that. But what it does make it is real. If I want realistic dialogue, I want it to have those moments of silence. I want it to have the occasional joke that doesn't land. I want the mundane awkwardness where all the parties are scrambling to find the next thing to say. I want someone to miss part of the conversation because they were distracted. That's what Watch Dogs 2 does, and that's why I love the writing. I've yet to see a more realistic approach to nerd dialogue than this. But here's the thing with writing like this. It needs to come from a place of authenticity, and when we pair the characters' words with their actions, their words feel disingenuous. Another major gripe with the game people have is with our favorite misused and misunderstood gaming term, ludonarrative dissonance. Semantically, ludonarrative dissonance is when a game's narrative themes are at odds with its gameplay. In Watch Dogs, we see DedSec as a group of good people. They're trying to bring power back to the people. They want to take down the bad guys. They're the heroes, but their actions speak otherwise. The guards you take down, are they part of a system that wants to harm you, or are they just doing their jobs? You may argue that there is the choice to be a pacifist, and that is true. Theoretically, you could complete the game without lethality, but why does the game then give you countless ways to kill? Most of the weapons you can 3D print fire real bullets. Marcus is a registered gun owner, and if the game didn't want you to use them, why does Wrench in the final mission show up equipped with a grenade launcher? Surely he doesn't plan on letting anyone out alive. You could argue that what happens in gameplay stays in gameplay, and I am more than happy to follow that, but it still doesn't solve the issue. Again, when Marcus and friends caused a mass blackout, despite no one dying, they took that risk without as much as a second thought, and may I remind you, they were warned about that risk. They risked the public by driving a car at dangerous speeds throughout the city, and Marcus's cannon tool is a fucking pool ball. And I don't care what you say, it may not be lethal, but the head trauma alone will ruin someone's life. There's no doubt some disconnect here, and while you can do every mission without killing, I can understand the sentiment that presenting the option is enough to break your immersion. Fortunately for myself, I always go for a non-lethal approach because I find it more challenging and rewarding. Something I want to note but not necessarily criticize here is the way DedSec is portrayed in Watch Dogs 2. In the first game, they are seen as a shadowy organization significantly more powerful than Aidan and so coveted that you need to pass multiple trials to get in. While the digital vigilantes make a return, the tone is completely different. Now instead of a tight-knit super squad, they're just a bunch of nerds, and the recruitment process seems pretty easy, especially when DedSec contacts are all over San Francisco. I think a big reason for my disdain towards the new tone, at least in relation to the first game, is branding. DedSec in Watch Dogs 1 wasn't always at center stage, and when they were, they had no aesthetic, no propaganda, no social media manager, and that made them interesting. Their interest was not in appealing to the people as a brand, but in providing justice and being Watch Dogs. Now you could argue that the DedSec group in Chicago could be different given the heavy criminal roots in the area, and since San Francisco is a much happier place tonally, and given that public support of DedSec plays a larger role, it makes sense that this DedSec group would function differently. But what's interesting is that the problems they face are the same. Watch Dogs posed a lot of questions upon release. With this new era of technology, with Big Brother always watching, what does crime, politics, daily life, and justice look like? It doesn't quite answer those, but Watch Dogs 2 aims to remedy that. What are the political implications of constant surveillance and artificial intelligence capable of convicting you of a crime you have yet to commit? The first game took no stance on it. Fair. Watch Dogs 2, however, aims to explicitly state those implications and use them as a means of commentary. That's right, guys, we're getting political. Brace for impact. Now, I know politics can be a sore subject, so as always, when I tackle these issues, I'm not going to comment on my own thoughts on what the game is saying about the real world, and rather look at how it plays into the game world. And if the ideas they are presenting are interesting enough within the context of the game. I know my political beliefs, but I'm not knowledgeable enough to confidently broadcast them to the world. In fact, I shit you not, I don't know what day of the week it is as I write this. My brain is in constant cruise control. And so with that said, Marcus's main motivation for wanting to stick it to Bloom outside of the ethical concerns with a system like CTOS is that he's flagged as a high-risk individual despite having no prior criminal record. Now this could be because he is a registered firearms owner, unemployed, or more likely because he hails from Oakland, a territory that the CTOS is deemed to be a shoot-on-site high-risk location for the San Francisco police. These specific areas, not just Oakland, coincide with the low-income areas, the people being priced out of San Francisco, and this is exactly the kind of dystopian ideas I like seeing. Insurance companies can deny you before you even walk through the door because of an algorithm, and those who are in the lower class are further held there because so many of their opportunities are determined by where they come from. When what we code into our machines is a reflection of our society, whether we like it or not, the ugly side of our society will bleed through. When your face is on every camera and those feeds are used to identify people who might be suspects in a crime, mistakes will inevitably occur. Now let's suppose an innocent person steps in front of a camera and happens to be of a darker skin tone. Facial recognition software, while it is improved improving every day, still struggles with accurately recognizing darker skin tones, and this applies especially so to women. Furthermore, what if this hypothetical person is from a low-income and thus high-risk neighborhood? Mrs. Innocent is now a high threat and a suspect for a crime and has no one to defend her. These are the problems the game subtly presents, though without much of an answer. A rebuttal to this issue is that with CTOS cameras being everywhere and with a digital footprint being unavoidable, in court this woman should be able to prove exactly where she was and when to a T. But let's look at a more overt example. When finding data on a new self-driving car, we see that the car, if danger is imminent, would choose whose safety to prioritize based on their life score. Something dictated by their income, race, gender, employment, education. Again, your life is in the hands of corporations that act as a biased judge, jury, and executioner. I wouldn't mind if Watch Dogs didn't fully flesh out this idea, but the problem I take with it is that they don't offer a solution, or much in the way of nuance. Watch Dogs 2 is comfortable painting a picture of a dystopia and outlining the intricate ways it can be used to create systemic injustice, and yet the product itself is not a cautionary tale. As the player, we love this world because we get to feel powerful in gameplay, and yet if this world were to become real, we would be nothing but powerless. The only solution provided by Watch Dogs is to burn everything to the ground, but I don't really agree with that. Taking down Bloom only gets you so far. No matter what, the most you could do is delay the inevitable. I understand I'm missing the point. A game where Marcus and friends infiltrate Bloom and ensure that the problems outlined in the game are solved in the most productive manner wouldn't make for a great game, but I wouldn't mind if the game backed up its mission objective in regards to extreme surveillance. The burn it to the ground story might be comparable to real life, and the game is saying that in order to get justice, you need to take it by any means, and while I struggle to agree with it, I can't necessarily say that approach is wrong. Revolutions don't often happen peacefully, and if there's one thing the team accomplishes by the end of the game, it's inspiring others to resist too. If not by the end credits clearly stating it, then by the gameplay mechanic of Watch Dogs Legion, which allows anyone to join the cause, and most are exceptionally willing. Eventually, the people will say enough is enough, and when DedSec can act as a voice for those without one, they don't necessarily have to beat the rise of technology to win. Maybe they just need to even the odds. Maybe that is their messaging, that in order to enact change, we need to mobilize the population. But then I ask again, mobilize and empower them to do what? Who the fuck knows? I'm looking way too deep into this. The point is that once again, Watch Dogs presents interesting ideas, but doesn't really do much with them. Overall, the story of Watch Dogs 2 is not great, and I can't disagree with people who think it's poorly written, but I also think it has one of the most unique casts in any game I've played. Every character, except Horatio, plays off each other so well that I'd be curious to see if this was all written, or if some of it was improvised. It feels that natural. Individual moments in the story work well. We have fun with the gang, watch sitcom-level cutscenes, get into hijinks, but the moment you zoom out, I can't help but wonder what this is all for. When it comes to the stories and mission structure of Watch Dogs 2, the game is at its best when simply helping people, which is exactly what the additional content under the Humane Conditions and No Compromise pack offers. Simply put, these handful of extra side missions is Watch Dogs 2 at its absolute finest. There are 4 operations available, and I won't bother going into detail on the story for any of these because they are all relatively surface level and follow the same pattern of some big corporation exploiting the people of San Francisco and the gang has to put a stop to it, but along the way we get some interesting new mechanics, characters, tools, and more to keep things fresh. And what this DLC proves more than anything else is that Ubisoft caught that lightning in a bottle, and these missions are Ubisoft churning out high quality content like clockwork. The writing here, love it or hate it, feels just like the main game. The gameplay is elevated, and most of the things I was annoyed with in the base game, notably the lack of a strong story, are toned down here. On the gameplay front, we have some new weapons to help us non-lethally take down our enemies. The paintball gun is here, and I couldn't really find a use for it. Apparently it used to be quite good, but has since been nerfed into the ground, which includes single player. That's okay though, because it leaves more room for the air shotgun, which is the most hilarious weapon in the game. I mentioned during the main missions that I preferred stealth to combat, but with the way this Goliath launches people through the air, I couldn't wait to get into my next gunfight. The best part is, if it's lined up properly, it can affect more than one person. I can't lie, there's no logical reason for loving this thing, it is just funny. Fortunately, there will be some new enemies for you to use this weapon on, as we now have enemies with jammers that can not only detect when you get too close to them, but prevent you from executing any hacks within their vicinity. This changes our goals with stealth. In many instances, the most effective means of getting past a guard is to permanently remove them through some kind of takedown. They won't get in your way now, and if you have to leave the same way you came in, you won't have to sneak past them all over again. With the jammer enemies, this is flipped around, where the most effective tactic is to manipulate where they move using your tools. While you can still take them down the old-fashioned way, there's a lengthy prerequisite of decoding the jamming signal, turning the jammer off temporarily, and then hoping they're in a vulnerable spot. Couple these improvements with the new locales you stealth through, a yacht, a factory, and a mansion, and we have gameplay that feels like it fits right in, offering something new but not reinventing the wheel. The same could be applied to the cutscenes here, which again exude this hilarious authenticity that makes me fall right back in love with these characters.
As much as I enjoy our banter and underlying sexual tension,
I'm hurt. I thought we moved on to overt sexual tension.
Marcus, there's something I want to show you.
On my laptop, dude.
Oh, were you?
Don't fuck with the hot sauce.
Whoa! Yo, that's like a line from a Cisco movie. Damn, that's my boy.
The exception to this is a character I was excited to see again, Jordy. My expectations were high because T-Bone integrated into this game surprisingly well, and yet Jordy, not so much. I like his delivery, I like his personality, but there's a subtle humor in how much he loves his job and himself that's missing here. I also didn't appreciate the one moment you work with him because he ends up killing me more than he did the enemy.
This might be loud.
While we're on the topic of characters I didn't appreciate, the entire operation with Lenny was just odd. She acts so strangely to Josh and not in any humorous way, and said behavior isn't explained. I know she's an antagonist, so we aren't necessarily meant to like her, but at least make a character like this one I enjoy hating. Aside from those minor issues, I love the DLC here, and further, I appreciated the new slew of multiplayer challenges provided here, which ramp up the difficulty in some considerable ways. I need to also address I haven't talked about the multiplayer much, and what is here is great, but in my attempts to get footage for this video, the multiplayer has refused to function due to easy anti-cheat not being installed. The catch is, it most definitely is installed. I've gone down numerous troubleshooting threads trying to solve this issue, but I just cannot for the life of me figure it out. The reason I'm choosing to just not talk about it is because the multiplayer is a cherry on top of a product I already enjoy, with its inclusion or exclusion not affecting my opinion of it. So here's where I'm conflicted on Watch Dogs 2. I totally understand the criticisms against the game, and in some ways I agree with them, and yet I still find myself coming back to it time and time again. Also, I think the game's disdain from fans of the first game is warranted given just how different it is. Its tone was the opposite of the first game, its gameplay the same, and its story, while still succeeding in providing interesting characters, did less in my eyes to build off the excellent foundation the first game set. It almost felt like Ubisoft was scared to return to the first game because of how poorly it launched. Keep in mind, Watch Dogs released in the same year as Assassin's Creed Unity, and both Watch Dogs 2 and Assassin's Creed Syndicate took a far more laid-back approach, as if to emphasize that Ubisoft twice now has bit off more than they could technically chew, and they've learned their lesson. Fortunately, Watch Dogs 2, in spite of it all, is a fun game. Does that mean good? Well, not in the same sense that the first game was good, but yeah, it's good. I'd be lying if I said part of this praise isn't much easier given the state of Watch Dogs Legion. I've loved Watch Dogs 2 from the start, but seeing the games it's sandwiched between, I know why I love it, and why I feel guilt. Because this game caused irreparable damage to the series. Watch Dogs now has two very different games with two very different fan bases. Now the issue is, which one do you satisfy? Legion was an opportunity to cement aside as a one-off, solidifying the series as either serious action-based or cheesy hacking-based. And what did they do? Well, yeah, fuck me. What did they do?
A restaurant opened up in
This is
SF,
what the city
and they're
is.
serving poutine.
I like that word.
And it's so bad. I mean,
I've
it's
written
just
to our
fucking
Pakan
bullshit.
about
I've had the real
relocating to
thing,
St. Petersburg.
and it's not that.
The time is right to make a lot of money in St. Petersburg. Knowing my luck, I will be sent to Florida. Oh, I thought you meant this St. Petersburg. Cruel joke.
Man, I can't believe it. There's so many tourists in this town now. Can't deal with it. I don't know these people. I don't even know why they're here.
Yeah, I was with Anatoly.